Sure. So that everyone has a go at the first question.
But when we talk about that, what you did was racist. I don't believe that.
But we're talking
I think
about
what you did was a mark of respect, and now that may have been inappropriate and it may have been taken wrong, but that.
You know that movie Get Out? I think Jordan Peterson totally would have been those people who's like, well, you know, if I was liberal, I would have voted for Obama at least 3 times. I was a huge fan of, you know, some of his policies. I've only seen the clip that's circulating the Twitters right now, where Jordan Peterson tries to word salad his way out of a whole bunch of conversations on the BBC. And that clip was so glorious, I thought I had to watch some of it. I don't know if all of it is going to be as glorious. I also don't know when that clip takes place. I mean, let's try our needle in the haystack here. If worst comes to worst, I'll just pull it up on the Twitters.
I find it interesting how £20 a week can be taken away from the most poor people in society, and it's really difficult for those earning over 80,000.
Well, Jordan Peterson was like the only person in the room who didn't clap at that. Right, I just feel like, you know, £20 is just a little too heavy. I mean, you're talking about rocks, right? Or lobsters, 20 pounds of lobsters.
Yes, the woman there in the green sweater.
I mean, how can
this was yesterday.
do their jobs properly if they've got another job on the go?
Stella, I mean, the Labour leader had another job on the go, didn't he? I mean, he was earning over 100 grand from legal work.
You want the political knockabout on this, and I
think it's a fair point, isn't it?
I feel horrified by all of this because I feel like I'm old enough to remember when we had the cash for questions crisis in this country. When I first started thinking about getting involved in politics, I wanted to change. No, I'm going back to John Major.
Oh, John Major.
That's how old I am.
Okay. We could go back to the Blair government as well on other issues, but okay.
And at that time, you know, it would have been shocking to me to think that the Prime Minister was involved. I didn't think John Major was involved. I just didn't think he knew that was going on within his own party. We know when the fish rots from the head, we're all covered by the stench. You talk about trust in politics. Right now, only 15% of people trust politicians.
British people, what is up with the fish analogies? I mean, I've had to endure a lot of them from Boris Johnson, but does every single sentence have to include one? Is that just you're not proper British unless you do it?
Tell the truth. The frustrating thing for me is, no, I don't think MPs should have second jobs. I don't know where people would find the time, for goodness sake. I mean, in the last month alone, I've just had a baby. I've got
the answers are all, it's an island.
I'm trying to work. I had 3,000 emails and requests from my local community, and I've been trying to deal with all of them. So where people find all these extra hours. But
and in fact, you brought your baby along tonight.
I know. Well,
he's backstage.
I have to, I'm working. And you know, if you want to talk about getting more people into politics, maybe open it up to mums. Crazy idea. But one of the things that really worries me about all of this is what Owen Paterson did, the original thing that's brought all this up. It's been illegal since the 1600s. It wasn't about whether you have a second job or not. It's about a conflict of interest. Yeah. Now, you know, there might be some second jobs. You might say, okay, you want people who are legally qualified because of the Attorney General. You might want people who are doctors who are qualified. But what you don't want is the conflict of interest. So I don't care whether you are doing 1 hour or 100 hours. If you are in hock to a private equity firm in the city, and therefore that affects how you vote, or it could affect how you're voting on the laws that regulate our finance in this country,
what you gonna
we've got
do
a problem.
about it?
That's why people don't trust us. And the problem is, do I think if I was that young, excited teenager thinking about changing the world when all that first happened and I was horrified but thought that still government could do good, would I think that now, looking at this situation? That really troubles me. I don't think I would. And I think about all the voices and people who will just be put off because they think it's about money.
But just to be clear, you started out saying you don't think MPs should have second jobs. No. It sounds to me like you're saying if they're a doctor or a nurse, then maybe yes, they should, which is the Labour position.
Actually, the main thing, I think, is that we should get the government, we should get parties out of this, and we should get the Standards Committee, which is a cross-party organisation, has lay people on it, to get them to look at it and look at whether we might have exceptions. And the only reason I think about doctors and nurses is because you have to keep your professional qualifications accurate. So there's a technical thing there. I don't think there's a particular case for lawyers. Yeah, I want to be clear about that. But you know what? The government's made such a hash of this. The best thing they can do for our democracy is to get out of it and let a group of people who are experts in it and don't have that conflict of interest deal with it.
You know, I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hock, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the I understand the conflict of interest problem, but one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics.
So instead, they all go into media. Thanks, James Lindsay. Thanks, Sam Harris.
As a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Woman there in the green top. Hang on, wait a minute. Let's just get the mic to you. There you go.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not
Well,
the
because
best
they've
people for the
demonstrated
job.
extreme competence in at least one area of
That's
the career.
banking. That's that person. This is why we're in the situation.
Yeah, they're hyper specialized. They're very, very good in their field of study. But if you look at James Lindsay, he's a really good example how you could be really good at one specific thing and then just ass at everything else. Just pure ass at everything you try to analyze.
We are with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency. There's no accountability that you get in industry. We don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
But that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude
No.
That what is perceived as a good leader.
No,
And
that's not
what
why you
the
have that
issue
problem.
is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know
making
people
that
like to think
such a-
that, but it's just not
corruption is
true.
good.
Based on what are you saying such things? What?
It's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic. And it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high level.
How are those two things correlated? Like, that could be completely accurate, that only 3% of the population is psychopathic. And then his justification for that is that there's not a higher percentage of psychopathy because at the end of the day, it's not going to be effective at achieving results. So that's why psychopaths remain at that level, at 3% of the population.
Levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability?
So why is
What
that
else do you have?
3% elevated as our leaders? Why is that 3% elevated as our leaders?
They're not, they aren't. That's wrong. And to think that way is
That was a joke. Yeah, of course not. Can you imagine? Like, if you want a Joker-fied future, there you go.
counterproductively cynical. It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, or that it's more specifically characteristic of political leaders than people who are operating at the highest level of
thanks,
capacity in
Valio.
other
Appreciate
areas.
that.
It's just,
And
it's
good
an
for you,
empty sort of
Jamal.
cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. It's simply not true.
Just very briefly,
Okay.
if I may, just on that point in terms of corruption and political leaders, everyone will be familiar with the fact that if you happen to donate £3 million to the Conservative Party, if you happen to be a former treasurer, then you'll so happen to end up in the House of Lords having been appointed by the, I think, Prime Minister. So there's a level of corruption that we probably need to look at in a little bit more detail, Jordan.
The man there in the blue sweater, you've had your hand up for ages. Yes.
Rather than banning the second jobs, do you think if all members of Parliament were allowed to have as many extra jobs as they want, they had to be unpaid, or the proceeds had to go to charity, things would change?
The brown person will answer first.
Yeah.
I mean, no disrespect.
That's it. So do you think that was wrong of me to come to you first?
I think so. I think.
Well, let's not do it then. Jordan. I don't mean that, I'm not being sarcastic at all. I mean, if that's how you feel, I respect
I
that.
do. I
Let's
think
go to
it's
Jordan.
important.
Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to
I
Jordan.
think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted...
The question is exactly...
up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but
Why
would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague
No,
term.
the inverted commas as if it's not a real thing. What did,
No, that isn't what it meant.
well, what did it mean next?
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking.
And
What I mean by that is, we use all these terms frequently.
This is it. I'm going to slow it down. Here we are. Why would you do that? Why would you put it in air quotes? Well, obviously it's low resolution thinking. I mean, it's not in 4K. Racism's not in 4K yet.
Frequently in discussions like this that are
He was
containers
called
of
abusive terms.
undifferentiated
He was
content.
repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's
Okay,
had people
well,
contact him.
then
If it
they-
walks like a duck, Jordan,
Then they
talks like a
no,
duck,
I'm not
it's a
denying-
duck. It's
I-
racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that
Yes.
question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism. Which
Okay, so this is the exact opposite of what I was talking about earlier. It's like the parallel opposite, that we have to just deal with all these isolated incidents of racism, because racism is pretty much uniquely when it is a white person saying the N-word to a black person. That's racism, okay? But everything else, I mean, that's just like low fidelity thinking. It's not in 4K, all right? It's like you're learning on a Zenith. That's pretty much it.
I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about
Low
institutional
fidelity.
racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem. The concept of structural racism, it's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and
Well,
let's
I
look
did
at the
it once,
evidence
so yes,
there
I'll
was.
try
So
to
the evidence
control it
was
in the future.
about the experience that Azim had, about multiple accounts. I think when we talk about structural racism, one of the things that really occurs to me, if I think about it in lay men and women's terms, is the bystander effect. And what is so powerful about his testimony is not just the explicit racism that he faced, it's the numbers of people who stood by and basically normalised that behaviour. And all of us have a challenge to ask ourselves whether we are normalising forms of racism. And actually, I think that's what Nazir called you to account to about Fiona tonight, was to say we normalise the idea. If we're going to talk about racism, we go to the person of colour first and ask them to give us their
can I just say,
hot
in my
take.
defence, I also tried to get everyone on the panel first as well, to make sure so that everyone has a go at the first question.
But when we talk about
that what you did was racist. I don't believe that.
But we're talking
I think
about
what you
Jordan.
did was a mark of respect. And now that may have been inappropriate and it may have been taken wrong, but that...
You know that movie Get Out? I think Jordan Peterson totally would have been those people who's like, well, you know, if I was liberal, I would have voted for Obama at least 3 times. I was a huge fan of, some of his policies.
That doesn't mean it was racist.
But
And
Jordan,
so we
you
are
asked-
going to be
you asked
precise
us to
about it.
define why the concept of structural racism. And we have a problem in British society. We have a problem particularly in sport. And we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
And how do you talk about structural racism without
I'm going to need to bring other people in as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
I need to
said
mention
nothing.
Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for some
and
anti-Semitic
himself
tweets that
has
he
said-
put out several years ago.
What I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
All right,
but bystanders are the challenge.
Let's hear from our audience. Yes, the lady in the green.
So, I mean, jokes aside, just to summarize, Jordan Peterson is definitely trying to say that we should stop talking about racism in the sense of talking about institutional racism or systemic racism, anything of that nature. We should talk about these isolated examples and then call them out for what they are. But otherwise, if you're going to talk about these kind of things, it's just going to divide us along the side of race, which is like the parallel opposite of what is being done. Like, if you have a critique of society and you look at it through like a sociological lens, and all of a sudden you're viewing the world, right? Like, so this is us reflecting upon how the world is acting. It's not the other way around. You're not creating racism by identifying that racism exists in society and that there are structures that uphold certain things. That's not the same thing. But that's what Jordan Peterson and most people who are terrified of CRT believe.
So whilst we're continuing this debate, have we thought psychologically how young ethnic minority children feel right now that are trying to get into this sport in their country of birth?
Right. Do you want to take that?
Absolutely. These are things that happen, but they happen for a reason.
No, I disagree with the use of non-standardized and non-reliable implicit association tests to act as a diagnostic agent for unconscious racism.
Yeah. So it's about the fact that we are saying...
Just ignore. Okay, fine. Yes, we don't really care about that. Anyways, I'm going to go into some points that are actually a little bit more salient. Unlike Mr. Salad over here, he's saying any word that comes to his mind, befuddled, if you will.
These young people, you haven't got a hope. And that you cannot contribute. And the football, as you mentioned.
Nintendo, thanks for giving Jack in the Box a tier 1. Appreciate you.
I mean, I pay enormous tribute to our teams and the work they're doing right now, and the fact that they're recognising the impact of racism in our society with the knee every game. But remember when they missed a penalty in the Euro finals? Who got the abuse? Rashford, Sancho, Saka. What were their colour? The reality is that when we fail, we are not allowed to fail. Sadly, when people who are not like me or like some of the minorities community, they fail, they're given another job. Look at the number of managers that get relegated, white managers that get relegated and get another job. If you're a black manager, you fail once, that's the end of it. That is what I mean about systemic racism. It's as deep-seated in our society, and it goes beyond sport. We haven't got time to do that, but it goes beyond sport. Because you know, we're only 5 miles away from Stephen Lawrence.
Oh, that's the end of it. Anyways, amazing little segment that is making the way around the internet now, where he's basically talking about structural racism and says that it's low fidelity thinking. You know, obviously the Dragon of Chaos has taught me that mother will make me racist if I'm a naughty boy, so I have to wash my penis against my wishes. Don't make me do it, mother. Also, Jordan Peterson has this really creepy backstory that I didn't really know about. Jordan Peterson is a University of Toronto professor, blah, blah, blah. He's a growing presence in Canadian politics. He's not a member of the Wakawak people of British Columbia. That claim, however, has appeared several times in Peterson's bios, which state that he's been inducted into the Coastal Pacific Tribe. It appears in social media posts. Peterson claims that he's been inducted into the Coastal Pacific Tribe. What do you mean by claims, you peddler of nasty, underhanded innuendo? What is their statement? I spoke to Charles Joseph, who confirms that Peterson is not a member, nor was he ever. Wow. That's super strange. Oh yeah, and he made this really racist tweet. It's good that you consumed the liquor this time instead of letting some Indians steal it. Out of context. It's not racist. You need to know the context. Read the sum total of all my tweets. Every single one of them.
This will come down to who can deliver the lower propensity and mid-propensity voters.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we will build a ladder to heaven to deliver you the daily news. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are your most humble of clownish jesters. To our lords, Trevor R. and Alexander Thaler, you have our undying fealty. To our knights of the round table, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariana McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Ants Are Still Running the World, Coulter Smith, Tom Groh, Val 9000, Jenna Tal, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Riley and Anna, Omni, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Incosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We shall meet you in the tavern, and we raise a drink, and we salute you.